Hello, I just wanted to let everybody know we're going to start in just a few minutes. We're just going to make sure that everyone has logged on and then we'll get started, okay?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, E-Cigs, Vaping, and Marijuana, Emerging Drug Trends in Today's College Students. My name is Grace Rowan, a graduate assistant at IHEC, and I'll be your moderator, along with Aisha, the assistant director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, and we are very excited to be hosting today's event. Before I hand over the microphone, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's webinar and the GoToWebinar platform. For those of you new to using GoToWebinar, you'll see the control panel on the right of your screen. This is where you'll find the question box that you can type and submit to at the end of the presentation. All attendees will be muted for today's program, but that doesn't mean you still can't participate. Please type your questions into the question box in the control panel. This will allow us to see your question and we will address them. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Aaron Weiner. Aaron Weiner, PhD, ABPP, is a board-certified psychologist and the Director of Addiction Services at Linden Oaks Behavioral Health. He earned his doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and completed his fellowship in addiction psychology at the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System. Aaron?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? All right. Can I get a response from another moderator that I'm audible?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, marvelous. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, rather, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to speaking to you about e-cigs, vaping, and marijuana. This is a topic that I speak on fairly regularly because I'm very passionate about it. What I have noticed is that there is a large gap between what we see in government publications and medical journal articles and psychological journals and the narratives that we hear in the general public. And this is driving a trend of a decreased perceived risk of use, which has been leading to an increased usage rate in these products. And so my hope for those on the call today is that I can provide you with some information that you haven't heard before, a perspective that might be new. And that you can use that to drive meaningful conversations with the people in your life. I put my email on the first slide here because I think transparency is critical. I'm happy to send you any of the sources. I think I do a pretty good job of citing most of it, but if you ever see something on here that doesn't have a citation on it, or even if you just like that document, let me know. I will send it to you. I think that particularly around these topics, there's a lot of truth and alternate truth going on, and we all just have to be very discerning consumers of knowledge. So with that, let's dive in. We're going to start with e-cigs and vaping, and then we're going to pivot to marijuana for the second half of the conversation. I think we're actually going to go about 45 or 50 minutes with the lecture, and then I'll be happy to take questions at the end. All right, so let's start with the basics. What are these things? Essentially, an e-cig or vaporizer is a device to heat a substance and create a vapor. So basically, whenever you're trying to extract whenever you're extracting a chemical out of a substance, you have to get it out somehow. And there's a lot of ways to do it. You could say eat it, and your stomach digests it, and then it's absorbed through the lining of the stomach. That's one way. Another way is that you could smoke it, which is you light it on fire, and the combustion releases the chemical, and then you inhale it. Vaping is just another way to release the chemical, and what it is it's you're heating the substance up to a very high point but below the point of combustion. So the chemical is released, but you're not lighting it on fire. And the idea behind that is that it is less harmful that way. We're not supposed to, you don't eat burnt toast, or you're not supposed to eat even barbecue that's been charred for too long. It creates carcinogens. And so the theory behind this is that if you are not creating those carcinogens, it's not as bad. And spoiler alert, that's actually kind of true, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But that doesn't mean that there's no repercussions either. They come though in a lot of different shapes and sizes. They share some similar features though, which I'll get in the next slide, which is that they've all got this battery on the bottom and handle. And you'll notice here that actually you can adjust the resistance there, the ohms. But one of the things about vaping, in particular, is that there's a subculture attached. This is, and like any subculture, you can customize it, you can make it your own. It's something that you can really slide into and be part of. And so one way you can customize your vaping experience is the device that you use, and then even how you use it, how much resistance that you put in the coil. So what you're looking at here is a nicotine vape, and it's one of the ones that has a chamber with liquid. So you can see down here that this is where you would fill it up with liquid, and then these wicks, which when it's exploded up on top, you can see the wicks there, then titrated up to the heating coil, where it's heated up and then inhaled through the mouthpiece. You either turn them on or off with a switch, or you complete the circuit when you inhale, and that's what turns the device on. So all e-cigs, and Juul's included, and we'll talk quite a bit about Juul in just a minute, have the same basic components, and this is what you're looking at. Now, it's worth mentioning that there is another type of vape, which is called dry vaping, which is for using THC wax or marijuana. So wet vaping is nicotine, and you either have these refillable chambers or pods, closed systems that are disposable, a la Juul, or you've got these dry systems that use the cannabis or the THC wax. And if you look at the diagram again, it's basically the same, but you have the ceramic heating chamber instead of the place where you put the liquid in. And that's really the main difference. If you're not familiar, THC extracts, this is what they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but these are what a couple of them look like. Basically, it's a highly distilled THC form. It can be up to 95% pure THC, and it's a much more convenient way as well of dabbing, essentially. So you take a dab of it and then you put it here, you can see on the heating coil. Previously, what you had to do was use a modified bong. There's something called a nail, a butane torch. It was really very, very, very cumbersome. And so actually one of the issues with this current vaping trend is that it's really lowered the convenience of use and the access to use these very high potency THC products, which, as we'll talk about in the second half of the presentation, are most associated with harm. So let's talk about Juul for a minute, because this is the 600-pound gorilla in the vaping world. So Juul right now owns 70% of the market share of all e-cig devices. That is huge. That's like Amazon-style dominance of an industry. And really they are just like any other e-cig, except they have these pods, right? So it's the disposable system, and each pod has about the same amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And the devices are very small. You can't really see the scale with the hand there, but you basically could fit it in a fist, and that makes it very easy to conceal. So like if you balled up your fist, it would basically just fit in there. So you can take a pull off of it, and then if you put your hand in your pocket, no one would know. Some people will just hold the vapor. If they're trying to be discreet, for example, they might just hold it in their lungs until it dissipates, or blow it out into clothing to hide that, which is used in a lot of environments where smoking would be inaccessible. Now, here's the Juul pods. The pods themselves cost about a little over $4 each, so it's also a lot less expensive than smoking. Here's a quick graph about market share. Actually, I'm going to be showing you some websites today, but I had an error. I'm in a place where I've got a firewall, and so I wasn't able to pull up the Juul website. But right now, you can actually buy a Juul, the device itself, for $10. They're on sale. They're usually a little more expensive, but you can buy a special edition blue one for $10. I think their base model right now is $15. So these, even from a financial standpoint, are not a high bar to get into. One of the issues with Juul, and why they've rightfully caught a lot of flack, is that they have been very disingenuous with how they represent their company's practices. So to give you an example, in April of last year, they said that they were investing $30 million in combating underage vaping, and that they don't want kids to use their product. Yet, basically at the same time, this was in October, a couple months later, the Truth Initiative came out with a study that found that teens are 16 times more likely to use those Juul products than all the older age groups combined. And so when you think about the business of this, because that's going to be a common thread throughout the presentation today, that this is a business, the business of addiction, and this is a business. When 16 out of 17 people who use your product are teenagers, you cannot afford to have them stop using your product. That is all of your revenue. That's well over 95% of the money that you're making. So what you're going to see is that there was a lot of saying one thing and then doing the exact opposite, which again is really par for the course when it comes to the addiction industry. So what does that look like? So flavors. This has actually been a big thing in the news recently, and I'm going to give Juul a little bit of credit. They actually in the last couple days did pull flavors other than tobacco and mint and menthol off their website. But we've banned flavors in cigars and cigarettes for literally a decade. The Tobacco Control Act of 2009 put tobacco under the jurisdiction of the FDA, and this is one of the first things they did, because we know that young people are disproportionately attracted to these fruity flavors. And so one of the big question marks has been for a long time now, why has the same not been done for e-cigarettes, particularly because the FDA has actually had the authority to do this since 2017. They've been sitting on this literally for years, and we know that there's a national ban that's been suggested, and we'll see if that comes to fruition. But as of right now, that ban does not exist. And Juul, until about 3 days ago, was doing exactly like everyone else was, selling mint and mango and cream for years. Again, up until about 3 days ago. Now, in terms of their target market. I got these photos from a really great New York Times article called "Did Juul Lure Teenagers and Get Customers for Life?" And these were the early Juul marketing campaigns. And when you look at them and you look at the people in them, if you ask yourself, like, do these look like a 48-year-old chain smoker, or do these look like young people dancing? It's more young people dancing. That's what it looks like. You get the bright colors. They are not marketing at the audience that they say that they're actually trying to get at. And there was recent testimony in a congressional hearing that supported this. So this was back in July. Multiple teens testified that Juul went into a 9th grade classroom and called its device totally safe in a 9th grade classroom, and actually has spent over $200,000 on social media influencers. And you don't spend $200,000 on social media influencers to reach the 50s and 60s crowd. They're not looking, they don't care. This was all going young. And again, this is par for the course. 90% of all addictions start before someone hits age 20. And a lot of the young people in college right now fit that category, 17, 18, 19. That actually is your target market. That's why when you look at ads for truly any addictive substance, if you think about alcohol, with the exception of like the most interesting man in the world, I can't recall any alcohol ad that features people over the age of 40 prominently. It's just not what you do, because again, that's not your audience. You need people addicted to your product to survive when you're in the business of big nicotine, big tobacco, big marijuana, etc. You have to get them young, and that's what you're going to see. All the marketing is aimed at right now. So I'm not sure if you've seen this as well, but I think it's important to be looking under the hood of these companies. This happened back in December of last year, actually. The Altria Group bought a 35% stake in Juul for about $13 billion. So if you look at the valuation, then they're about a $40 billion company back in December of 2018. So if you think about this as well, that means that the $30 million they said they were putting towards a public health campaign kind of seems like peanuts in that capacity. But these are literally the people who make Marlboro. This is big tobacco. And I'm sure most of you on the call are familiar with what they did, but they produced their own research. They did a lot of very shady things to fool the public into using their tobacco products well after they knew that it caused cancer, because they're in this to make money. That's what it's about. And that is the legacy of big tobacco. We're still losing, I believe the number is 480,000 people every year due to nicotine-related death. Even now, when use rates have declined. So these guys bought into Juul. Now, what was very interesting about this, well, actually two things. One is that, and I don't have a screenshot of this, the Juul CEO stepped down a few weeks ago and was replaced now by a longtime Altria exec. So now actually one of their longtime executives is the CEO of Juul. But that aside, there were a lot of people at Juul who were not so happy about the idea of being part of big tobacco, about literally selling out to big tobacco. So the next day after this deal went down, every employee at Juul got an average holiday bonus of $1.3 million. $1.3 million. So what this is it's saying, oh, so you have a problem. Well, here's $1 million. How do you feel about this now? These are the sorts of tactics that are very common in this industry about paying off lawmakers when people have a problem because they are making so much money off the backs of human suffering. They can massage through a lot of problems by throwing money at it, and that's what happened here. Now, how else has this been going on? So these are some Forbes headlines from this past summer. So ahead of that congressional hearing where the ninth graders testified, and it was found that they spent $200,000 on social media influencers, Juul crossed $1 million in quarterly lobbying payouts for the first time. So that means, if we're rounding up a little bit, that they were paying about $4 million a year to lobby to promote their product. Which again is something that I think a lot of people aren't thinking about. But this is how you make it such that the FDA does not ban flavors 2 years after they had the ability to do so. Now, another note. The major vaping industry, this was in August, which is again worth mentioning, and I'm going to, particularly once Juul took their flavors away, I'm going to tip the cap a little bit to them actually taking the right actions, but they withdrew from this organization, this vaping group, after this happened. But the vaping industry group that all companies were part of, including Juul, at least initially, has sued the FDA to delay the e-cigarette review. So the FDA has told vaping companies, because right now the production of these things isn't well regulated, we really don't know what's inside, the vast majority of them. They said you have until May of 2020 to submit all of your products for our safety review. And they are suing the FDA to say that May of next year is too soon, and it's going to create undue economic hardships for these companies if they're forced to submit their products for review by May of next year. So they're trying to get an injunction. It's kind of breathtaking to see that this sort of thing is going on when we're in the middle of a literally deadly vaping epidemic. And then here's just another one on Juul specifically. So in San Francisco, which was the first place to ban vaping, selling vaping products in general, they actually spent $4 million there alone trying to get that voted down. And again, you don't invest that sort of money in lobbying unless you're going to make far more on the flip side, because that's what lobbying is all about. You invest the money in the front end to get the politicians to do what you want, so that then you can make that up 10, 100-fold on the other side. That's how these businesses operate. It's how it has always been. So one other thing I want to point out about this, before we'll talk about the flavors for a minute. So the makers of PAX invite you to the Juul launch party. I'm not sure if you saw this on the last slide. A lot of people don't realize Juul is actually an offshoot of the marijuana industry. So PAX has long created vape pens for marijuana products. And if you look at the era, look at that. That's basically a Juul over there. That's because Juul came from PAX. This wasn't like a bunch of public health officials sitting around thinking, well, what can we do for harm reduction for cigarettes? This was the people who were making a product to consume the most harmful derivative of THC that we have, to consume it at a time when it was illegal. And they thought, you know what, let's bring this over to nicotine. We can do this over here too. So that's actually where Juul came from. Now it's worth mentioning that they have suspended flavored vapes, and this is right hot off the presses, right? This is like 5 days ago. And again, this is after years of doing it, but they did. However, what's important to know about this, let's pull over to the websites here. Here we are. I need my mouse. My mouse is going to be important. I cannot see my mouse. Let's see if I can I get my, all right, we're having issues with my mouse. Let's see if I can do it with my keyboard. I can, we'll work with that. So here are, so this is just one example of Eon pods. And if you go down here, you can see Joule compatible pods. And look at that, right? So there's a raspberry and watermelon and pineapple, and it's all still here. And actually, they advertise if we could go inside, and it looks like we're going to have to go mouseless for this presentation. But if we could go inside, you'd be able to see that they actually advertise as having more nicotine in them than regular Juul pods do. So although on the one hand, it's nice that that they did that. On the other hand, it's not actually going to solve this problem overall, and this is why we really need leadership, ideally at the national level on this. So let's talk a little bit about vaping jargon. So I mentioned this is a subculture. So when you are when you're growing up, particularly when you're in middle school and high school, but I'd imagine there's still quite a bit of this that goes on in the collegiate years as well. You're trying to find a group. You're trying to fit in. You want to be part of something. And one of the great equalizers about drugs has always been that you do not have to be smart. You don't have to be funny. You don't have to be attractive. You don't have to have a skill. All you have to do is put the substance in your body and you're part of the club, and you belong. And so for youth who aren't attached to something else that they form their identity around, they are the ones most at risk to fall into any sort of drug subculture, vaping or otherwise. But vaping absolutely has it. One of those websites that I'd pulled up there, oh, there's my mouse. I've got it. Fantastic. Is from amps to zero, and we're not going to go through all of this right now, but you can see just every letter of the alphabet, on and on and on and on. There's like a whole lexicon here, but there are a couple of terms that I want to highlight. The first is juice. So juice is the e-liquid that is used in devices, but you're not going to hear e-liquid used very much. It's generally just going to be juice when people are talking about the nicotine fluid. The throat hit is the feeling of the vapor as it hits your throat. And this is something that some people like, that some people do not like as much. It's something that you can customize with what you formulate the base with, or how you use your device in terms of if you remember back to the resistance. There's ways to customize it, but it's another preference that you can have, a way to make it your own. And then the blend of the juice that you're using. And you're going to hear two terms that make up most of the bases, and those terms are PG and VG, which stand for propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. So propylene glycol is thinner and has a stronger, more chemical feel in the throat hit. If you're trying to simulate the feeling of smoking, oftentimes that's what people will recommend. Vegetable glycerin is thicker, sweeter, has more vapor involved. So I want to show you how this looks when buying it again, because I think marketing is important. So here's another website where you can buy vaping fluids, Vape Wild. And if we go down and you look at these things here, like Murica, strawberry cheesecake. This is the name of that drug from that Bradley Cooper movie. Slow-mo, strawberries and cream, tiramisu, vanilla butternut. And you ask, or the Sherbinator, and you ask yourself, like, again, who are these more aimed at? Young people or older people? The answer is pretty clearly young people, and there's other categories here too. See if I can get it to pull up. I know I can't click right now, but you've got breakfast, fruit, sweets, dessert, beverage, and tobacco. But that's the vast minority. I did queue up one here. Strawberries and cream, so I can show you what's inside. So you can change the size of it, and then here's where you can change that blend between vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol. again, it changes how the vapor feels. And then also the nicotine strength, where you can go from 0 all the way up to something tremendously high. So there's a lot of different ways to customize this and to change it to be exactly what you want it to be. All right, so this is appealing to teenagers for a number of reasons. It's very easy to conceal the use. It's low odor in many cases, no smoke. We've heard from both young people in high school and in college that that bathrooms become like vape shacks, where people go in and it just smells like the aerosol. And for people who are not vaping and who do not want to be exposed to that, and again, spoiler alert, there are toxins and carcinogens in there. It's like being in a hot box. It's not. It's actually something that's very unappealing to them. And I've heard reports of people oftentimes leaving, just even leaving collegiate courses to go vape, and that it creates an additional issue in that way if they're not just doing it in the room. But the no smoke also causes an issue because it's not picked up by standard smoke detectors. There are vaping detectors that are available right now, but they'd be hard to utilize in a collegiate environment versus a high school, because it's one of those things where you would have to send someone to go investigate what's going on, and so that would be tougher with the campus. So as mentioned, can be used in the bathroom or discreetly in the classroom. It has this marketing advantage with the flavors. The Surgeon General released a report on this that found that 85% of young people said that they wouldn't be vaping if it wasn't for flavors. So this is something where the flavors really are key here. And Juul looks like a flash drive, so it's very easy to conceal. It's not like if someone was just glancing over it that it would look out of place on somebody's desk or near a computer. So a quick note on background and prevalence about this. They were invented in 2003 in China, introduced in the US in 2006. They're produced there where very few regulations exist. And this is a huge issue, and part of why the FDA is asking for all of those products to be submitted. I think, honestly, given the situation, May of next year sounds like it's way too late. Not too soon. But there's really no safeguards that what's inside these pods or these vials is what's written on the outside. It's kind of like what we're seeing with cannabidiol right now, where there's all sorts of impurities. Some have THC, that sort of thing. When it's not regulated properly, you don't know what's going to be inside. Adult use is rare and less than cigarettes. So right now, what we have is about around, if we're going in the middle of a couple of studies, about 4% of adults are currently using vape devices, as opposed to younger people who are not teenagers. And many of them are also smoking cigarettes. Now, what we see with youth use is very different. And so we're going to start a little before college, and I do have a slide on college as well. Essentially, long story short about this, because we have a lot of information to get through today, you can see here in high school, it's been going up and up and up and up, while other things have been largely going down. Same thing in middle school. And actually, the most recent publication from the National Youth Tobacco Survey found that it's going up even faster. So a 78% increase among high school students, 48% increase among middle school students. And this has actually led to the first increase in high school and middle school smoking rate in literally decades, because we do have a strong link between people, young people who vape, going on to smoking. So this is very concerning and unfortunate, given how long we've seen this downward trend, because there's a lot of negative implications to nicotine use at a young age, particularly when your brain isn't done developing yet. And it's nothing that we want people exposed to. So in terms of the college use trends, the most recent data we have, actually, this is from the Pew Research Center, is that it has literally doubled in the last year. This actually also, and I think I've got this in my next bullet, is probably low. So it's basically saying it went from somewhere in the vicinity of like 10% to 21% of college students between 2017 and 2018. However, peer estimates from another study, so this is asking college students, how many other college students do you think are vaping right now? They said 4 out of 5. So the truth is probably somewhere in between those two things, but that is a tremendous amount of young people getting dependent on nicotine right now. Vaping in college is associated with both drinking and binge drinking behavior. as well as psychiatric disorders and substance use disorders. So this is, and I should mention, this is correlational, not causational, but at the same time, so I don't know which direction it goes in. But if you've got a student who's vaping, chances are higher that they're engaging in these other less healthy behaviors and might have some underlying behavioral health or mental health concerns that they could use addressed. So why do people vape? They're perceived as healthier than regular cigarettes. PG and VG-based solutions are viewed as natural, and vapor sounds like water. This is something, again, that's all about lowering perceived risk. So but one of the basic tenets in drug use and drug policy and drug prevention is that the lower the perceived risk of a substance, the more someone is going to use it. And so when you're messaging out these tropes like using the word vaping and vapor and natural and like it's just nicotine salts and water and stuff like that, it lowers any reservations people have to giving it a try. And part of the issue with this as well is that just because something is natural, it does not mean that you should be breathing it. Like just about everything, like if you walk outside and look around, just about everything other than air you probably should not be putting in your lungs. And propylene glycol is one of those things. Actually, what's interesting about this is, and I'm spoiling an upcoming slide a little bit, but one of the toxins and carcinogens that we find in vaping aerosol is formaldehyde. And it was, same as with cigarettes. And part of the reason for that is that actually propylene glycol, when you heat it up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, like you do in a vape pen, it degrades. The chemical composition changes. And one of the things that it decomposes into is formaldehyde. So there's a lot of issues with how people are perceiving these devices. Not as bad for you does not mean good, and it does not mean benign. And more details on that in a minute. For smoking cessation, it's very easy to change dosages. Worth mentioning in this case, though, I was actually just prior to this webinar, I was at a meeting where I was presenting to about 12 area legislators about no, actually not, this was, and I talked about this a little bit, but we were talking mostly about the opioid epidemic, but someone was mentioning when it comes to the vaping epidemic that they were worried about people going back to smoking if they weren't able to get their vape flavors. And I think that's a great example of one of those things that's really pushed out by the industry, because like that's their lifeline, that's how they hold on. But the fact of the matter is that even if we ban flavors, there's still mint, there's still menthol, there's still tobacco flavors that you can use if you want to. And even beyond that, if you really don't want to smoke, we have Chantix, we have Nicorette, we have Wellbutrin, we have cognitive behavioral therapy, we have hypnosis. I could keep going. There's so many things that you could do and not smoke. Just, blueberry vapes are not the only thing there is. So you can use it potentially for smoking cessation, although the evidence about that is actually kind of mixed. It works for some people and doesn't for others, but just as a quick aside, I don't think that's a reason not to ban flavors. Adolescents and young adults, again, this is one of the main draws, and then also that they feel it looks cool. This is something that's very in for them right now. And as I mentioned, entry into a social group and identity. So right now, I'm going to just go through what we know. This is going to be a little bit dry, but I think it's important that we just put it out there. Everything that I'm going to talk about comes straight from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They are a very reputable organization, and actually everything they publish is freely available online. This is a 700-page report, came out, I think, about a year and a half ago now, maybe two. So here's what we know. There is conclusive evidence that in addition to nicotine, most e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances, including metals from any number of different parts of the vaping apparatus. And there's substantial evidence that it's capable of causing DNA damage and mutagenesis, which is the thing that causes cancer. So while we don't have a large amount of studies to show that vaping causes cancer, because vaping is kind of new, we do know that vaping causes the thing that causes cancer. And there have actually been 31 toxic chemicals found in a study out of Berkeley lab in vaping aerosol. Here's the formaldehyde that I mentioned. Here's diacetyl. This is what causes popcorn lung, by the way. And what's interesting about that, popcorn lung, it's a irreversible, potentially fatal lung disease that got its name because it was first found in workers in microwavable popcorn plants who got it from inhaling the vapor that was coming off of large vats of artificial butter flavor. Because when artificial butter flavor gets heated up to a very high, it gets heated up, it decomposes. And one of the things that it decomposes into is diacetyl. Just another example of how what's written on the label in vapes doesn't mean that's what's chemically going into your lungs. Here are just 10 of the cancer-causing chemicals in the vapor as well. And you can see some of the heavy metals there, cadmium, lead, nickel. There's our formaldehyde, there's nicotine down there at 10. So there's a lot in there. Now, why this matters is that there's a number of reasons. And I do want to talk for just a brief minute about this mystery vaping epidemic that's going on right now. We actually have the first death related to this in the world that we know of in Illinois back in August. Right now, we're currently at 33 deaths. The CDC usually releases something on this every Friday, but we're at 33 deaths, about 1,500 people hospitalized for this. Across the country, and we have no idea why. All we know at this point is that the inside of the lungs look like a chemical burn akin to mustard gas. That was from an article published by Mayo Clinic about a week or two ago. 80% of cases involve a THC vape of some sort. However, 20% of them, of the people who have come down with this, have never used a THC product. A lot of the products that are being used, implicated both with THC and nicotine, are from street sources. However, there are some people who have not used any street sources whatsoever, and are also, both deaths in Oregon, for example, came from dispensary-given THC vapes. And we have someone here, I just found out this morning, in DuPage County, Illinois, who is been hospitalized for this vaping-related lung illness, who has only used Juuls. So one of the scary parts about this is that we have no idea what's actually going on and what's causing it, only that it's getting worse. And what we're hearing is that it's not looking like it's going to slow down. One of the things when I speak to students about this is I make it very clear, this is a very current proximal issue. I think when it comes to these nicotine products, it's easy to say, well, that won't happen to me, or I'll just quit in like 10 years and I'll be fine, and my lungs will recover. Some people are going from not vaping to hospital within 6 months. And a lot of these people are actually young. I think 50% of the cases, the statistic is, are under 35, and 20% of the cases are under 25. So it's not like young people are immune. And I think that if I were on the bubble of this and I cared about my health, yeah, of course, nothing you're going to say to some young people are going to change what they do with addictive products. But I feel like we're at a leverage point right here with this crisis where we might be able to change some minds with a little bit of truth and education. And so I really do try to be as forward about this as I can when I speak with young people. So to finish off this slide, there is conclusive evidence that other than nicotine, the amount of toxic chemicals varies depending on what you're using, the juice that you use and the vape pen that you use. And there's substantial evidence that they are addictive, which makes a bunch of sense because it's nicotine. The areas of benefit here are really just confined to current smokers. Did I skip over? Oh, I did not. Okay. Current smokers, under typical conditions of use, exposure to potentially toxic substances is below cigarettes. So yes, there are fewer toxins there than in cigarettes. That does not mean that there are none, though, and that they aren't doing something very negative to you. There's also moderate evidence that secondhand exposure to nicotine is lower as well. So fewer toxins coming out of the device itself, fewer toxins when you exhale as well. And this is before the current vaping epidemic, but back at this time, there was conclusive evidence that if you completely substitute in e-cigs for cigs, you'll have less toxins in your body, and completely switching has reduced short-term adverse health outcomes in several organ systems. Again, that has now been reversed. The Surgeon General has recently, and CDC have said we should not be vaping THC products for any reason whatsoever right now. And the CDC has also said that people should consider not vaping any products at all, including nicotine, until we know what's putting people in the hospital. There's moderate evidence that they might be less addictive than tobacco cigarettes, and there's moderate evidence that it can be used for cessation. So before we pivot over to cannabis, I guess just to put endpoint on this before I'll talk for about 10 more minutes and then take questions. If you are not already smoking, there's no reason to vape nicotine, period. If you're not already poisoning yourself with tobacco, you're just poisoning yourself less with vaping. That's the way that I prefer to frame it. So if that in that context, it could be useful. That said, right now, I would be very hesitant for anyone to vape because we have no idea what's killing people and putting them in the hospital. For a while, they were saying they thought it was vitamin E, but then that one turned out to be kind of like a red herring. We don't know. Bottom line is we don't know, and it's not localized to any one brand or any one product. So now is not a good time to be vaping. So let's talk a little bit about marijuana, and then we'll move on to questions. So it's a particularly bad idea for teenagers. I'd like to talk to you about why. So first, there's an increased risk for addiction here. First of all, I want to completely disabuse anyone of the notion that it is not addictive. Marijuana is an addictive drug. It is the second most common drug that we see in rehab right now in adults, and the most common one that we see in rehab for high school students. We have had a verified physiological withdrawal syndrome that we've seen in both humans and rodent models for about 15 years. So there's zero debate about this actually in medical literature and in the addiction field, but that is another one of those narratives that you hear that lowers the perceived risk. It's addictive like alcohol is addictive, where it's not like you use it once and you're hooked for, hooked forever or something, but it works its way into your life, and then eventually your body starts to crave it and need it. But young people are even more vulnerable because their brains aren't done developing. Your frontal lobes are actually the last part. That's that blue area on the front of the brains there. To develop, and that's what's associated with planning, executive function, decision making, motivation, et cetera. What that means functionally is that adults, the rate of addiction right now is 1 in 10 who uses marijuana is going to develop a use disorder, 1 in 6 for young people. This also is not Woodstock pot anymore. It is much, much, much stronger. And this is one of the core takeaways that I hope you can take from this section of the presentation. It's very different. So back in Woodstock, the THC concentration was 3 to 4%. And by 2012, that had actually climbed up to 12% was the average amount in marijuana flower. Right now, it is 21%. So one joint of today's weed is like lighting up 7 from Woodstock at the same time and smoking them. It's like a whole different level. And so when you're looking at escalating harm, because THC is what's associated with that escalating harm, already the young people of today are starting from a different platform. This isn't even to mention those concentrates, which again can get up to 95% THC. It's linked to negative academic and vocational outcomes. I'm going to go through this quickly to not belabor the point because we're lower on time, but basically in both high school and college, it leads to increased chance to skip class, lower GPA, longer time to graduate. It then projects into actually a decreased lifetime earning potential. The more someone says that they've smoked over the course of their life, in general, the less money they tend to make. They're going to talk about the brain in a second, but part of this also could be social, because if the group of people you hang out with is smoking pot regularly, they are probably not the people spending Saturday nights in the library studying for their upcoming test. So you're basically selecting yourself into a peer group that is valuing different outcomes and different things than academic and vocational success on average. And in terms of the brain, so this part's really important too. So our brain is not done developing until we're about 25 years old. And until then, when you introduce psychotropic chemicals of any sort that impact the brain, it can elicit a reaction. And so what you're seeing here is a really good meta-analysis looking at the role of cannabinoids in neuroanatomic. Hold on. Let's just deny that for now. Let's see if I can get my magnifying glass. Not working right. All right. Neuroanatomic alterations in cannabis users. And we are, let me just make sure we're good here. So looking at neuroanatomic alterations in cannabis users, my magnifying glass is not working, so I will just explain to you what we're looking at. So this is literally changes in the structure of the brain. For each bar there, this is a compilation of studies, a literature review. If it's gray, that means that those studies did not look at the brain structure. If it's blue, it means that they looked at it and found no effect. And if it's red, it means they looked at it and found a structural change in the brain. So the first row there is looking at dosage. So if we go over to the one there on the left, that's basically saying the majority of studies, about 85%, found that there was a structural change to the hippocampus by dosage. So the more THC that someone used, very high chance that their hippocampus's anatomy has changed. This one here in the middle is the prefrontal cortex. That's about 45% by dosage. What the second row is saying is looking at duration. So how long someone used THC products, regardless of how strong they were. Those two ones with red, again, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So memory formation in the hippocampus and executive function in the prefrontal cortex. Here's another way of looking at it. This is looking at SPECT scans of 62,000 brains on accelerated aging, and what they found was that cannabis misuse, and we're going to say misuse because abuse is stigmatizing language that we're trying to avoid, second only to schizophrenia in terms of patterns of brain aging at 2.8 years off brain life, and alcohol misuse 0.6 years. So that's another common thing that you hear was not as bad as alcohol. It's not as bad as alcohol. Really depends on what you're talking about, and particularly for young people, it's pretty bad. This study here, so what's the cognitive implications of this? This is looking at 4 different domains of cognitive functioning by marijuana use. And for each graph, so this is working memory, nonverbal skills, long-term memory, and inhibitory control, so your ability to control your actions. Each graph, the red and the blue, are on different sides. The blue is no marijuana, the red is the most marijuana. And if the blue is on the bottom, you want it to be on the bottom. If the blue is on the top, you want it to be on the top. And you can see that they're always on opposite sides, which again makes sense if it's potentially changing the structure of your brain. Impaired judgment, including increased risky sexual behavior, psychotic breaks. This is such a big one, guys. So Linden Oaks Behavioral Health, we have a 108-bed psychiatric hospital. At any point in time, we have 2 young people in there from marijuana-induced psychosis. This was published in Lancet Psychiatry back in March, looking at 11 different sites in Europe. What they found was that you have a 50% higher chance of developing schizophrenia if you use marijuana flower, a 500% chance, greater chance if you're using those extracts. It made national news, as you could see there from CBS. They found that 12% of first case episode psychosis could have been prevented across 11 cities, including 30% of all first case psychosis in London and 50% in Amsterdam. Like this stuff is really striking. Of course, it doesn't mean that everyone who does it is going to have a psychotic break. That would be ridiculous, but that is not how risk works. That is not how population health works. And that's part of why these trends are very disturbing. The other thing to know just about high potency THC use is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So there's another study came out at about the same time that found that after legalization in Colorado, ED visits tripled. And those were one for the psychotic breaks, but the other was cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is something that happens when you have too much THC in your body and you have very severe abdominal pain and you can't stop vomiting. And it's very unpleasant. If you talk to emergency department physicians, they know what you're talking about. You basically put these people in a pod in the back and wait, because there's nothing you really can do. You just have to wait. And this also worth mentioning, because this is another trope that you'll hear a lot. There's been at least one case well documented. This was national news. I got this from USA Today last month. A 17-year-old who died from the dehydration of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome directly. He literally vomited himself to death. This is not to mention, of course, like car crashes and burning your house down and all the other things that could happen. But there's a lot, again, there's a lot of messaging out there, particularly making comparisons between marijuana and alcohol or marijuana and heroin, as it's like, well, it's not as bad, therefore it's something that I should do. It's an interesting way of looking at it. It's like saying, well, I was just jumping out of a 3rd-story window, at least I wasn't jumping out of a 5th-story window. It's like, well, maybe, I guess that might be like not as bad, but maybe the better thing to do would be not to jump at all, or I'm not sure if that's good reasoning for jumping out of a 3rd-story window. But this is another implication of high dose THC. And drug driving, for sake of time, I've actually taken a lot of slides out of this presentation, but it is not safe to drive high, period. And we know that young people are very unclear on that fact. I was at one school that found 4 times as many people had driven high in the last, or been with a high driver in the last year than with alcohol. People do not understand the risks here, and the risks are very real. And beyond that, we have no reliable way of knowing how impaired we are on THC, either as an individual or as the police. We don't have any truly valid methods for that right now. So last point I want to make, I think it's my last point, I'm almost out of time, hopefully it's my last point, is about another controversy that I want to make the case is not a controversy about it being a gateway drug, or drug sequencing as we call it in the literature. So what I want to draw your attention to here, this is the national level data from SAMHSA, 10 times higher illicit drug use if a young person's using marijuana. Here is a study from 2017, and we have replicated this with a different data set that finds that recreational marijuana use is associated with an odds ratio increase of 5 times or to 8 times increase to develop a new addiction to opioid painkillers. So if you're using marijuana recreationally, you're 5 to 8 times more likely to develop a new opioid pill disorder. And 92% of people who have used heroin say that they used marijuana at some point in their past before then. Now, what a lot of people say about this is correlation does not prove causation, and that is absolutely a true statement. But I want to submit this for your consideration. First, we do not know that smoking causes cancer because we did not do a randomized double-blinded trial where like 30,000 people chain smoke for 50 years and another 30,000 people don't, and look who's dead at the end of it. We didn't do that. What we have instead are very strong replicated correlational data and a clear mechanism of action. And so we say that smoking causes cancer because we've got DNA mutagenesis and we've got the correlations. So with marijuana as a gateway drug, we have the correlations. We've had it for years across a number of different paradigms. The mechanism of action, though, with an addiction is social and behavioral. It's not entirely biological. Because here's how this works. No one, you take someone young, you walk up to them with a bag of heroin. Say a friend walks up to them with a bag of heroin and says, hey, you want to tie off and inject this with me? And they've never used a drug before in their life, they're going to go, no, I don't want to do that. That would be a really tough sell because nobody starts with heroin. Nobody does. Instead, what happens is they walk up with a vape pen and everybody's doing it, and it's just nicotine, salts, and water anyway, right? So try this, and then someone brings a THC pod or a jewel pod that's been altered, and then they're doing that, and they're smoking pot because it's going to be legal on January 1st anyway, and isn't it a medicine, and it's just a plant, so it must be fine. And now you are hanging out with a crowd where this is what they do to have fun. At some point, someone brings along a hallucinogen or cocaine or meth or Oxycontin, and you try that, and that you really like that because of the euphoric effect of opioids. And at a certain point, if it hooks you and your money runs out, you go to heroin because it's cheaper, and you usually start by snorting it because that's again a lower perceived harm, and then eventually you inject it. And I can tell you a story like that because I've seen it hundreds of times in my clinics. It is just it is the story, and it doesn't mean that everyone's going to do it, but you don't. But if heroin is step 5, you cannot get to step 5 unless you take steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you don't take step 1, you're never going to get there. So the last thing, I actually do have a little more I'm going to show you. Sorry to cutting into questions. I'm happy to stay a little bit late if anyone's willing as well. But I want to show you what's going on with marketing for these products because I think it's important. So here's some examples of Colorado with candies and lollipops, but I want to show you what's going on here in Illinois as well, because I think that this is really important to see. So in what's supposed to be a medical market. So here's our dispensary in Naperville, which is where my hospital is. And I'd like you to look at the names of these substances with me and just ask yourself, like, does this sound like medicine to you? 707 headband, urban poison, alien rock candy, flow, bio Jesus, ghost train haze, grape god bud, Maui Wowie, OG18. If you're not familiar, OG stands for Original Gangster. And Platinum Girl Scout cookies. And if you thought Girl Scout cookies couldn't get any better, then behold. So here's the thing, guys. Like this is not marketed at 65-year-old women with MS. It never has been. It isn't now. I mean, even look at what they're doing here. It says that OG18 was the winner of the High Times Cannabis Cup in '09 and '10. It didn't win that because it was so good for glaucoma, right? Like this is one of these things where you could call this anything you wanted to. You wouldn't know what Advil did unless someone told you, or Tylenol, maybe Mucinex, like a little bit, like a little bit. You could call this anything you want. This is on purpose, and it has always been on purpose. Um, Here's another example of this is like an edible with 500 milligrams of THC, which is tremendous, by the way. It's literally made out of Cocoa Pebbles, Fruity Pebbles, Captain Crunch, and Trix. If I had my magnifying glass, I could show that to you, but it's made out of kids' cereal. And what's worth mentioning here too is here's what's going on in Colorado. And if you look at what they have there, Chem 4OG, Alien Bubba, Super Lemon Haze, Northern Lights. Here's Flow. We have Flow. Blueberry Headband, got that too. Urban Poison, we got that too. So, this is what it is. It's actually, and we could talk for a long time about the medical marijuana field, but the bottom line is that marketing is always on purpose. It's always on purpose, and this is not aimed at older people because again, 90% of addiction starts when you're young. So. 1 in 4 12th graders indicated they'd try marijuana if it were legalized in their state for Monitoring the Future 2018. So that's something as well, looking into the future years in college, that we're going to have to start thinking about with the incoming seniors. So to bring it back around, and then I'm going to talk just for a second about interventions. Just recently, a new study came out that found that if you are vaping nicotine, you're 3.5 times higher, more likely rather, to use THC products than if you're not. So a lot of these things, they go hand in hand. They work together. The companies own each other. There's a lot of this that ties together, and it's all about money. It's all about money. So what can we do? I just want to throw a couple ideas out there for you to consider, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Policy change. So school policies around vaping, but then with an enforcement plan, because toothless policies won't get anything done. Or go upstream and advocate for flavor bans. Go talk to your state legislatures. Call your representatives. They actually are listening to you, or at the federal level would be even better. Public health campaigns to impact those ambivalent students, and because cultural problems require cultural solutions. That's what's going on here with vaping, in my opinion, is that it's seen as cool. It's a cultural thing now. We have to change the culture if we're going to actually get people to stop. And then offer nicotine cessation assistance, like therapy, medications, and so forth. One thing that I want to bring up that I subscribed to this just to see what it was like. It's a very cool product from the Truth Initiative called This Is Quitting. Also, apparently, cravings are a bitch. But this is an organization that really tries to relate to young people, and they've got a really great product right here that actually does not contain any swear words, but that actually sends you supportive text messages, and you can basically chat with a chat bot if you're having a craving, gives you motivational stuff, and it actually tailors the slang that they use, which again, all appropriate, but it tailors the slang by age group. So you put in your age when you start, and it'll send you the appropriate messages. So this is another thing that I found, and I actually talked to the Truth Initiative about. I gave them a call. It's a very cool product. So to summarize, vaping and marijuana are both chronically misunderstood, and it's not an accident. There are very rich people trying to get richer at the expense of young people, essentially. And there's a lot of misinformation that's going out there that's being seized on to rationalize behavior and to promote it, that is very unhelpful for public health. From a health perspective, no one should vape if they aren't already smoking cigarettes because of all the things inside them that are so negative. Marijuana is far from a benign substance and is particularly harmful for youth, and again, particularly as it pertains to brain development. And these THC extracts can be vaped, and this higher potency is associated with the most severe side effects, and that's one of the most concerning aspects. If you're joining us from Illinois, you're probably aware there have been no caps put on the vaping, there's been on the THC concentration in products. So we can have 90-95% pure THC products that people can just buy as of January 1st. So thank you guys so much for your time and attention today. I know I was talking quickly. I had a lot that I thought was really important to say in the time that we had. So if you have to leave, thanks again. And if you can stick around, I'll stick around to answer some questions.
Thank you to our presenter, and thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We do have just a few minutes to go ahead and talk about a few questions that we've had come in. One of them is a request. We would like to know if you could post your email from the beginning. A couple people were very interested in maybe emailing you some questions or for further discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, I'll go back to the first slide. Here it is.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is someone had a question. Is there a reference available for the information stating that outcomes related to cannabis use lead to decreased lifetime earning potential?
Absolutely. Please, please just shoot me an email with that request. My email is like my to-do list. So just shoot me an email and I will send you that reference.
All right, thank you. And another question that came in is, how would you suggest quitting vaping? What are for someone that is currently vaping?
It's a really interesting question. I think um, there are far fewer published tools out there for nicotine and vaping cessation than there are for smoking cessation. Right now, the best hypotheses we have are that the same products that we use for other nicotine cessation would be effective. So kind of like what I listed in terms of Chantix, nicotine replacement therapy, like with Nicorette, Wellbutrin can be useful for some people. In terms of therapeutic techniques, we look a lot at like grounding techniques, meditation to be able to quote unquote like ride the wave of a craving to get through the other side and acknowledge that although your body seems to be asking for it, it's not the requirement that it feels like. Hypnosis actually has pretty good efficacy for nicotine cessation as well. It could be worth a shot. We practice with young people refusal skills because in the social situations as well, being able to navigate uh, uh, the society right now and navigate their social ecosystem is very challenging with all the vaping that's going on. So really feeling like people have the tools to deal with both their internal states as it pertains to a nicotine addiction, as well as the external pressures that they're under.
Okay, thank you for that. And I have another one. What would be the top 3 risk of vaping, or the number one risk, I guess, is the question. It's either of those. If you have the top 3, or if not, just even the number one risk that you have.
Yeah, well, right now I'd say the number one risk is death.
Okay.
I mean, I start there. So until we have any idea what's going on with the hospitalizations and deaths, that is really serious. When the CDC and the Surgeon General say don't do this because there's a crisis going on and we don't know what's causing it, one of the things that blows my mind about this is that if this were like romaine and we were talking about like E. coli or salmon, like it would be off all the shelves. You wouldn't find it at any grocery store, Costco, Whole Foods, like Jewel. It would be gone. It would have been gone months ago. Yet here we are, voting to sell THC vapes, which is what we're being warned against, community by community, and we're still selling these. It's kind of nuts to me. But the first and foremost, we have to be attentive to this acute illness that's going on that we don't know the cause of. Now, beyond that, when it comes to, I think I talked for a bit about the marijuana side of things. From the nicotine side of things, and particularly nicotine vaping, we do have some risks, at least in animal models, risk to cardiovascular models, and there is the DNA mutagenesis and cancer links down the line. What we have to be very mindful of is that scientists don't like to overstep, and we haven't had as long to research vaping devices as we have cigarettes. And so people aren't going to come out and say it's connected to something until we've got the data. So we just have to work on some inferences and best ideas based on educated guesses right now. But the bottom line is that until we start hearing different things from the CDC updates that come out every Friday, and if you're interested in the subject, I encourage you to watch for those or follow me on LinkedIn, where I really try to push this content out whenever I see it. it's until we see that change, I would not recommend anyone vaping. But even if you're trying to stop smoking cigarettes, we have so many safer options than vaping right now. That's what I'd be concerned about.
Okay, one last question and then we'll wrap it up. And um, before I ask this, I want to, because I notice a lot of people are having to go, I wanted to put a plug in there. If anybody's interested and really enjoyed this presentation for our Illinois affiliates, um, Erin will be presenting live at the spring affiliate meeting. We have registration forms on the IHEC website, and we would, like to invite anyone that would like to see him in person for a lot longer than this 1 hour webinar to feel free to come on our website and get registered for that. The last question that we had was, what suggestions would you have for enforcement strategies on a college campus? And it's said that they are working on making policies for their campus to be 100% smoke, vape, and tobacco free.
Mm-hmm. Well, so here's what I would say, and I think enforcement's tricky because when you can buy a Juul for $10, it's difficult to enforce your way out of something like this. I think that people would I wish I had a good answer for the enforcement side. I don't. It's something where if it's going on in a large lecture hall, for example, what can the professor possibly do? There's really no way to do that as well as you'd like. So maybe there is a good solution. I don't have that off the top of my head. I do, however, think that setting cultural standards like having nicotine or smoke-free campuses can be a great start. I think Michigan State did that about 3 years ago. I was reading an article about that, so I'm sure they'd be happy to share. And I believe they're saying they feel like it's been a very successful intervention. So I'm sure that they'd have some ideas on how they implemented it and operationalized it and rolled it out. That said, I think it would be a very interesting case study if anyone wanted to do this and publish on it, to really try to do a cultural intervention in a collegiate environment. So you'd have to start getting influencers within that environment, professors who are respected, but students in particular, students who have pull, people who care. You'd have to create materials, have slogans, but really try to, at least within that sphere, within that particular micro ecosystem, change the culture around vaping, because that's what happened with smoking nationally over decades. The problem is we don't have to wait decades. We don't want to have to wait decades to see this happen again. So I think that if someone could come up with an intervention like that or a process like that that can work to start to change the minds of large and change the culture of a collegiate campus, that would be immensely valuable to the entire country.
Okay, I appreciate that. And if we had any other questions come in that I didn't get answered, please feel free to email him. I know he has stated before that he would be more than happy to answer any questions you guys have. And once again, I can't thank you enough for coming to our webinar. In about an hour, you will receive a follow-up survey, and we will be posting this and uploading it to YouTube, and it can also be found on our website. I will put the link on there. So we thank you all for coming, and thank you, Erin, so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming as well.
Thanks.